Hunters, it's time for you to get a build. While there are a lot to choose from to make my first hunter video, I've chosen to make it on this build as it's not only one of my all-time favourites, but I feel like it has fallen under the radar a lot due to Prismatic having a very similar build. However, this build I'm making a video on today still stands strong on its own in the meta game, and with some of the artifact mods this season, it is even more optimal than it otherwise would be. I would like to say, however, that unlike my first two builds, you will have to own a certain expansion, that being Shadowkeep, to obtain the exotic that is necessary for this build. While I like to tailor these builds to newer players if possible, for PvE I feel like there is only one strong hard meta build that a free-to-play player can use, that being the Celestial Nighthawk build, and currently due to the recent patch, that is all players are talking about, and so I wanted to make my first hunter video on a build that was different. Let's start with the exotic for the build, that being Assassin's Cow, giving us both invisibility and health regen upon kills with either our charged melee or our finisher. This effect will be stronger on stronger enemies. This leads us to the melee attack of the build, that being Combination Blow. What this does is we get 3 times increased damage for our melees on melee kills, 1 stack per kill, stacking up to 3 times. It also regenerates our class ability instantly, which we will use with Gambler's Dodge to recharge our melee instantly when using this near enemies. The cycle for this build is very simple: melee kill, dodge, melee kill, dodge. Every time we get a melee kill, we will both regen and go invisible, making us basically immortal as long as you don't screw up this combo, with finishers being a last resort on higher end enemies. For aspects, we'll start with Lethal Current, which after dodging, it makes our next melee attack have an increased lunge range, jolt the target, and defeating any jolted targets will blind them. We kind of use this aspect because there's not really much else to use with this. The 2 aspects we are not using, that being Temper Strike and Ascension, don't really help this build in any way. As for our second aspect, the big one, we'll be using Flow State. Defeating jolted targets making us amplified is a nice effect, but the big effect for this is when we are amplified, we get our dodge back more quickly in case we don't have it for some reason, we are more resistant while dodging, and we reload more quickly. The resilient while dodging gives us even more survivability, which is the big part of this aspect, to keep us alive even longer. As for fragments, I'm going to be honest, I am not a big fan of the arc fragments. I think most of them are kind of lame. However, there are 2 that are an absolute must for this build. That being Feedback, taking melee damage, increasing our melee damage, plus 10 resilience. I think it's quite obvious why we need that. And Resistance, again, giving us even more damage resistance when surrounded by 3 or more targets, which is again very strong in a melee heavy build. But to be honest, it's strong on any 3 arc build. This is the best arc fragment in the game by far. Your other 2 fragments are really up to you. I personally picked Spark of Ions for more ionic traces after jolting a target, defeating jolted targets, and Spark of Shock giving us jolt on our arc grenades, essentially giving us more grenade energy back. Grenades are not an integral part of this build, but you'll find in more ways than one, we stack into them to an extent because there's not really much else to stack into. As for the grenade we use, I'll be using Pulse Grenade. Some may argue Blinding Grenade is better, and you'll see why in a minute when it comes to the artifact. I just personally don't like Flashbang Grenade, as even if I was to use it, it would only be good for this season due to the artifact mods, which again I will come to in a minute. Finally, for our super, I'll be using Gathering Storm. While Storm's Edge is very cool, it is very much a PvP based super, and despite the buffs to Arc Staff recently, I much prefer a DPS super over an Ad Clear super. That's the subclass. Most of it is pretty set in stone with the exception of 2 fragments, however, although feel free to customize however you want. For the artifact, there's actually a lot of artifact mods this season that help with this build dramatically. The first being Total Carnage, giving us even more damage resistance on finishers. I think it's pretty obvious why that build is good. We also have the Thick of It, giving us even more armor charge while surrounded, which is also very cool. And we have Trace Evidence, which gives us even more ionic traces, giving us even more grenade energy. Again, grenades are not integral to this build, but there's not really many more artifact perks to choose from with the final two being Conductive Cosmic Crystal, giving us even more damage on our arc abilities. We cannot get this on our own as we don't have a stasis debuff in this build, but there's nothing really else to pick in this final column other than arc compounding, giving blind more arc damage. When a target is blind, they will take more arc damage. This is why I said earlier that some people would prefer use Flashbang Grenade over Pulse Grenade, but even if that's potentially true, that build is only here for a season, and I like to make my build videos to last, and I don't really want to make a build that only lasts for one season, especially because we're already in Act 2. I know they're technically called episodes, but they're the same thing. Now on to weapons. Weapons, this is mainly a build for solo dungeons in my opinion. This is where this build shines the most, and as a result your weapons will be changing per encounter. However, I highly recommend using a Volt Shot weapon due to jolting being easily accessible through Volt Shot weapons, and as I mentioned earlier, our aspects have things that they do when jolted, such as defeating jolted targets with melee attacks blinding them, and jolt making us amplified, which is the big one. As for which Volt Shot weapon you use, it's mainly up to you. I personally like the iClose SMG, it's just my favourite one, but there are a lot of other options such as Nation of Beasts, Subjunctive, Posterity, and Indebted Kindness. It should be mentioned that I'm sorry, but every single one of these weapons requires some form of DLC content. iClose requires the Witch Queen, Subjunctive Final Shape, Beyond Light for Posterity, Forsaken for Nation of Beasts, and finally you need the Lightfall Dungeon Key to get Indebted Kindness. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, there's not really much else to say. The weapons are largely up to you. I've just put on Wardcliff Coil because it's arc and well it fits. There's also a boss in the final dungeon, the newest dungeon, where this is the hard meta, at least for hunters. So that's why I'm using it. Now on to stats. You're obviously going to be stacking into Resilience. It is not only the best stat in the game by far, but on a build where we're so close and personal, Resilience is even more valuable than it normally would be. We don't need to build into Mobility. Now Mobility is actually not useless on a Hunter unlike the other classes because it gives us our dodge faster. However, for this build specifically, we get our dodge back instantly due to Combination Blow, hence why again on this build specifically, Mobility is useless. Recovery is also useless due to us having a massive amount of health regen due to Assassin's Cow. It's not as useless as say on the Titan Bonk build because the Bonk build had a healing grenade in sticky situations, this does not. So recovery is a bit more valuable on this build but ultimately still not worth it. Strength, we're going to get strength, we don't need strength because we get our melee back instantly with our dodge. That leaves you with only really two options left for your second and third stat, that being Discipline and Intellect. I personally prefer to stack into Discipline over Intellect for two reasons. One, the Ionic Trace sort of sub-part of the build feeds into Grenade energy, and so stacking into Discipline makes a bit more sense there. Second of all, this build mainly shines in dungeon content, with all but the first one, Shattered Throne, having raid banners. It also does well in raid content, and every raid has a raid banner. You will start with your super as a result of that in every encounter, and you probably will get it back by the time you need it after using it, especially in a boss encounter. You'll get Gathering Storm back before the next boss DPS phase. As a result of that, Intellect just isn't that valuable of a stat for me. I only stack into it because the other three are pretty useless. At least for this build. Recovery has some use in other builds, but these two are always useless. So yeah, Resilience, Discipline, Intellect are the three best stats. Discipline and Intellect you can swap around kind of, but Resilience is the best. What a surprise. Right, let's get on to the armor mods to finish up. I'll start with the helmet. I recommend an Siphon, sorry I can't talk today. An Arc Siphon mod for increased orbs on Arc Final Blows. It makes sense, Arc Weapon Final Blows, we're using an Arc Weapon, get more orbs. What's not to love? I'll also be using a heavy ammo finder. If you wanted to use something like Font of Wisdom, Ashes to Assets, or Hands On, that would also work. I just like heavy ammo finder in dungeon content, especially for bosses with a lot of health, like the Corrupt Puppeteer or the final boss of Go to the Deep, because you're going to run out of heavy ammo. A tip for you newer players if you're low on heavy ammo, regardless if you're using this mod or not, holding your special weapon will make enemies more likely to drop heavy, and holding your heavy weapon will make enemies more likely to drop special. Just a nice little tip. For gauntlets, we're obviously going to be using heavy-handed, we're getting powered melee final blows all the time, infinite orbs, obviously. I like font of focus as well for the plus 30 discipline. If you wanted to take something like impact induction instead, because we're getting a lot of powered melee final blows, you could do that. However, I've just always liked font of focus personally. Onto the chest plate, you will be changing your armor resistance mods based off the encounter you're in. However, I draw attention to this on this build because due to the close nature of it, I highly recommend a melee damage resistance mod. Now onto boots, I'll actually be using 2 arc surge mods, and for certain bosses I'll actually be taking resilience off and putting a 3rd arc surge mod. In case you don't know what these do, these mods give you a 10, 17 or 22% damage boost to that element based on how many mods you are using. And like I said, this is mainly a dungeon build, we'll be doing damage to dungeon bosses, it makes a lot of sense. However, you will obviously be changing your surge mods based off the element of your weapon, you won't be staying with arc just because this is an arc build. Alternatively, if you wanted to forego the surges in favour of things such as better already and recuperation to stack even more into the health regeneration, that is completely fine if you want to play more cautious. I personally think we have already enough, so I won't be doing that, but if you're a little more passive or a little more safe in your playstyle, fair enough. To wrap up finally, for the cloak, I use 2 time dilation mods to just make our armor charge last longer. For those of you who don't know, armor charge lasts 10 seconds by default, and then 1 time dilation makes it go to 15, 2 to 18, 3 to 20 seconds. 3 I think is a bit overkill because we have to sacrifice some stats, but fitting 2 in makes sense, especially because we don't need a font of restoration for this build due to us already having health regen readily available. Finally, I add a bomber mod. We're using a lot of class ability, we get more grenades, and I kind of had the energy to spare, so why not? One final thing I forgot to mention for you newer players, these mods will only work when you have armor charge, which is gained from orbs of power, hence why I've put a lot of things into this build that give you orbs of power. But if you're not running armor charge, it's still nice to use them, because mods such as heavy-handed will generate literally infinite orbs for you and your allies, which hey, they might be using builds that they need orbs for, or it just gives you your super faster. So what's not to love about it? I've already explained how the build works, but it should be noted that unlike Solar Titan and their Bonk Hammer, this build is much more built into the survivalist style of play, whereas Bonk Hammer is sort of a 50-50 between surviving and one-shotting big majors. This build is way better for large groups of smaller enemies, and it arguably is better in the survivalist aspect thanks to invisibility, but you're not going around one-shotting high-level enemies with this build. This build is also not really good at killing champions as opposed to Bonk Hammer. You'll also see in the gameplay that I do finish some of the major ogres that spawn, yet I do not go invis, so maybe Assassin's Cowl is bugged right now, I'm not 100% sure. Finally, I fully acknowledge that the prismatic version of this build with the cloak is way better for killing high tier enemies, but after making my Bonk Hammer build video, I didn't want to make a video on essentially the exact same build just for hunters. This build gives us a much more ninja style of vibe as opposed to being some sort of unstoppable force, and the difference I found really cool, and as a result I made this build video as opposed to prismatic hunter. I also wanted a video that was more friendly to newer players, and while not everyone can get Assassin's Cowl because it requires Shadowkeep is cheaper than Final Shape, and I feel like more people would have this exotic due to it being a reward from that campaign as opposed to having to farm for the cloak. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to subscribe, I'd highly appreciate it. The rest of the video is just gameplay of me soloing a dungeon boss with this build. Thanks for watching.
Peace.